Hello, everyone, and welcome to Highland Heart, the music of Robert Burns, a virtual Behind the Bookcase tour brought to you by the Rosenbach here in Philadelphia. I want to thank you all so much for joining us for this event this evening. It's really wonderful to have you here. My name is Alexander Ames. I am Collections Engagement Manager at the Rosenbach, and I will be your harpist this evening, as well as your guide to some of the wonderful rare books and manuscripts in the Rosenbach's rich Burns collection. I'm joined tonight by my valued Rosenbach colleague Andrew White, who has graciously agreed to monitor the chat box and manage the Zoom technology for our event tonight, which is no small task. And so I really appreciate that. Thank you, Andrew, so much for doing that. I'm going to say more in a few minutes about the purpose of tonight's event, the content that we're going to cover during the time that we spend together. But first, I really just want to set the mood for the program with a bit of a musical prelude, so to speak, consisting of one of Robert Burns's most famous love songs titled I Walkin' O. This particular song is a traditional tune that Burns had collected. And as was common for him, he would collect sort of the artifact of this song and its lyrics, the tune and its lyrics, and then sort of expand and refine based on the traditional Scottish origin, so to speak. It tells the story, like so many of Burns's beautiful songs, of a sort of a lovesick person who is struggling with these feelings of romance and so on. So I'm just going to begin by diving right into playing this piece for you on harp, and then we will discuss the Rosenbach's rich Burns collections. So that piece is just the first of many musical moments that we will enjoy together tonight, but I thought that it was only appropriate to get a tour of this nature off with a musical start. So I hope that you enjoyed that piece, and I will return to the harp very shortly. I'm going to tell you more about Robert Burns in a moment and give you sort of more background information about our collection at the Rosenbach and about the intellectual approach I take to Burns and his music. But really, one of the great pleasures of this particular opportunity is to showcase wonderful objects from the Rosenbach collection with you. Tonight's program is going to be quite interactive, and so I want to begin our time together by asking you just to spend a couple minutes taking a look at this etched and engraved print, which is a part of the Rosenbach collection. And I want to pose some questions to you and invite you to enter your thoughts into the chat box. So take a look at this image and please consider these questions. What does this image communicate about Robert Burns? I'm sure that many of you out there in the virtual audience are probably already quite familiar with Burns, and that's great. You might be able to pick out some of the literary works, the poems that are referenced here, and some of the other symbolism in this image. I also want, and you can feel free to share that in the chat, I also want to ask you, if you knew nothing about Burns before looking at this image, what would you learn about this historical figure? So take some time, look at this. When you have some answers to those questions, put your thoughts in the chat box. And I'm just going to invite Andrew, whenever we start to have some answers coming in, please, Andrew, just read them out for us all to hear. And I can tell you as well, in a couple seconds, I'm going to advance my slides so that you can look at those vignettes a little bit more closely.
We've already had that bottommost image ID'd as Tam O'Shanter.
That's right. Probably one of the most recognizable on the print. I'm going to advance my slide now so that you can all see the images a little bit more closely.
And we've also had a comment that it's clear from the image that Robert Burns was a romantic.
Yeah, for sure. Sort of the wild natural landscape, the very atmospheric nature of the print.
And we've also had a comment, if I didn't know him, I'd guess he was Scottish by the thistles everywhere. And we've had another poem ID'd, upper left, the Twa Dogs.
Yeah. Yeah, some of the poems are really clear, or some of these images are really clear references for sure. Some maybe are a little bit less obvious. Well, thank you all for sharing your thoughts. Please continue to enter them into the chat box. I'm going to try to ID some of these vignettes for you. We had a couple identified already. Some of them are, more explicit than others. I think we also have some gentlemen there toasting Auld Lang Syne, and what I have labeled just sort of a generic, what seems to be a love poem of some variety, with those two lovebirds on the upper middle image that you see there. So thank you for taking a few moments just to look at that image. I love looking at objects closely to try to sort of learn more about what they have to teach us. This print that we're looking at, a copy of which we have in the Rosenbach collection, it first appeared in a publication called Payne's Universum or Pictorial World, being a collection of engravings of views in all countries, portraits of great men and great specimens of works of art of all ages and every character, which was published in London in 1850, so several decades after Burns's death, and Burns features very prominently in this volume. So when we look at the image in its totality, you see it back on the screen there, we certainly can sense that by the middle of the 1800s, Robert Burns, the Scottish poet who we're going to be talking about more tonight, had already really established himself as a key figure in Scottish identity and as a key figure in Romantic literature, as one of our participants sort of noted earlier. He wrote a large number of classic poems that you see referenced on this work of art, and Burns is so closely associated with Scottish sense of place, which we certainly also see in this image. This artwork I find to be a wonderful summation of Burns's cultural significance, and I hope that you've enjoyed taking a closer look at it with me. All of this was really a prelude to laying out sort of what we're going to do together tonight in this program. My hope for this tour, the chief goal that I want to accomplish, is really just to give you an introduction to the Rosenbach's wonderful collection of Robert Burns' rare books, manuscripts, and artifacts, and also to lend those objects, those silent objects, a sonorous quality by playing some Robert Burns songs on my harp for you. I truly hope that this event will really only be the beginning of your voyage into our rich Robert Burns collection at the Rosenbach, and so I'm going to provide you with some other resources to continue your exploration of our holdings. We'll spend approximately an hour more together, perhaps a little bit longer based on how much conversation and discussion we have. But we have a lot of topics to cover in this relatively short amount of time. The first thing I'm going to do is tell you a little bit more about the Rosenbach. I'm sure that many of you on the call probably have visited our site before, but maybe some of you haven't. So I want to tell you more about the Rosenbach. I'm going to give you some basic background information about Robert Burns and about my instrument of choice, the Celtic Harp, which, not surprisingly, is an appropriate instrument on which to play some of his musical works. We're going to talk about one of my favorite sort of lenses through which to consider Robert Burns is how he has been interpreted and reinterpreted for his political legacy and his sort of cultural resonance over the centuries. We're going to talk about how Burns connects to some important topics that were shaping the world, the Western world, around his lifetime, especially looking at gender politics and gender dynamics. I'm going to tell you some information about a really interesting and important Philadelphia connection to Robert Burns and his long-lasting legacy, and finally give you some resources, as I mentioned earlier, to continue exploring this topic on your own from home, and then hopefully eventually coming to the Rosenbach to see our holdings in person. All of this will be punctuated with some musical interludes, and I've also planned an Auld Lang Syne sing-along to close out our time together this evening. I figure if Garth Brooks can lead a sing-along of Amazing Grace at an inauguration, I can certainly have a sing-along as part of this Behind the Bookcase tour. So needless to say, we're going to talk about a lot tonight, so I just want to upfront summarize what my key points are that I hope will resonate with you as we explore these topics together. The first is that Burns is unique sort of in literature, in the arts, because he, like some other figures at his level of importance, really brings the arts together. Text and sound come together in song, and I would argue that to understand Burns as a literary figure, we do have to place him within that musical context and within the social context in which he lived. He's a really distinctive cultural figure whose lasting legacy has this sort of creative tension built into it. He's an intensely local figure in the sense that obviously he's deeply associated with Scotland, but he's an undeniably global artist. And that really is important to bear in mind when we think about how he resonates even today as a leading Romantic poet. His political legacy is an example of the difficulty of taking the partisan views or the partisan players of one generation and trying to translate them into future generations. Burns was a product of the 18th century, especially those last tumultuous decades of the 18th century, and we have to place him within that sort of revolutionary imperial context. Even though we like to think about him in this local Scottish context, we have to have a global viewpoint in understanding him. Finally, there are some important Philadelphia connections to Burns's legacy, of which we can be very proud, and the Rosenbach Burns collections are available for you to use and enjoy. Burns is such a complex figure in literature, in history, and in the arts, in large part because so many different aspects of culture are expressed through his work and really play into how he is remembered today and why he is remembered today. Burns's choice of writing in the Scots dialect as well as Standard English, his uniting of the written word with song, the strong sense of place associated with his work, all played a role in constructing Scottish ethnicity, collective memory, and it's not an exaggeration to say a strong sense of nationalism. And that is, in one way, how Burns has been used over the centuries. We're going to return to this chart a little bit later in the program to sort of sum up what we've learned about Robert Burns. So before we dive in any further, I want to make a few little disclosures because of sort of all the moving parts of this program. Please do bear in mind that this program is being delivered via Zoom, as you all know. So it's the quality of the sound of the harp is not going to be recording studio quality. It is Zoom quality. I've worked pretty hard with Andrew and some others to make sure that the quality is as good as possible, given the sort of limitations of the technology. But there you go. It is what it is for now. One of the things that I'm going to do after the program is send you all a sort of curated list of recordings of the pieces I play so that you can return to them and hear sort of professional studio recorded versions. Also, I will warn you, I live next to a busy road and train tracks. So at some point there might be some disruptive background noise, so please forgive me if that does happen. One thing to bear in mind, I think that we have this problem more or less resolved, but I would urge you to keep your own sort of volume dials handy, simply because when I've been rehearsing this program via the Zoom platform, sometimes the volume level when I go between playing my instrument and talking can vary. So you should be prepared to have to either turn my voice way up, maybe adjust the volume of the music. As I say, I think that we got that resolved this afternoon, but please do be aware of that and know that if you all of a sudden can't hear me, probably you will be able to before too long. It's just my microphone does a sort of calibration thing. So I think that we've got that problem solved, but I did just want to mention that to you. Okay, so let's move on and give some background context for the rest of our program about Burns. The Rosenbach, the organization hosting this event where I work, happens to have one of the world's greatest Robert Burns collections. It's something of which we are rightfully, I think, very proud. The Rosenbach is an historic townhouse, which was home to Dr. A.S.W. Rosenbach and his brother Philip Rosenbach, who were really the preeminent dealers in rare books, manuscripts, and fine and decorative art in the early 20th century. We opened as a library and museum in 1954 and have core collections in American history, British and continental European history and literature, as well as fine and decorative art. You can see the two townhouses that today comprise the Rosenbach on your screen. We have approximately 400,000 objects in our collection. So we have a really sizable collection, and Robert Burns is one of our great areas of strength. I do want to thank you all very, very much for buying a ticket, to attend this program tonight. It's very meaningful to us. It's only through your support that our organization is able to continue to offer programs like this during this really strange pandemic time. If you are able to and willing to contribute even more, I would ask you to consider making a donation of any size to the Rosenbach, perhaps become a member if you are not a member already. We really need support from people like you to not only bring you programs of this nature, but to steward the collections that we are showcasing for you tonight. So please do consider making a donation. Andrew will enter that URL into the chat box so that you have easy access to it. So that's basically sums up what I wanted to share with you about the Rosenbach. We'll return to our Burns collection specifically in a moment, but I want to first tell you a little bit more about the Celtic Harp, seeing as that's the instrument that I'm playing for you tonight. The Celtic Harp, as the name would suggest, has a very long association with Celtic Gaelic culture. A lyre, which is a sort of, cousin of the harp as we know it today, was found on the Isle of Skye in Scotland and dates to 300 BC. So needless to say, this sort of stringed instrument has a really ancient association with the Celtic lands. Many medieval images of harps survive in medieval manuscripts and other sort of medieval artworks. 3 actual medieval Gaelic harps survive in Ireland and Scotland. One of them you see pictured on the screen there to the left. That is known as the Queen Mary harp, circa 1450, and is in the collection of the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh. So again, this is just an artifact that points out this important association between harp and Celtic culture. Early Celtic harps would have sounded somewhat different from the instrument that I'm playing today, just on a very basic level, because of the construction of the instrument. Instruments of this early period would have been wire strung, and so it probably would have had more of a wiry metallic sound. Classical harps were strung with gut, and today my instrument is strung with sort of a combination of gut strings and nylon. So in that regard, the instruments do sound a little bit different. Celtic harps really enjoyed a revival beginning in the 19th century with a sort of broader revival in folk culture. And that revival really, it stretches all the way to the present day. Anyone who learns folk harp or Celtic harp today is really a part of this, at this point, centuries old revival of interest in these traditional music forms. There you see also on your screen a picture of me performing at the Rosenbach in person back in 2019. I do want to reiterate that the harp is not just a Celtic instrument. It is closely associated with the Celtic peoples, but it is not solely associated with the Celtic peoples. Here are just a few examples of other harp-related objects from the Rosenbach collection. You can see a copy of the works of Horace, printed in the 18th century in London, that depict classical lyres, which were important to the poetic recitation of classical verse. And you also see a really beautiful print by the Swiss artist Angelika Kaufmann, dating to about the time that Robert Burns was doing some of his greatest creative work. So all of this just to show that the instrument has much broader, and not just Western either. I mean, there are many cultures, South American cultures, Asian cultures, for which harp is very important as well. So with that established now about why the harp is an appropriate instrument for this sort of program, I want to tell you a little bit more about Robert Burns. Again, I'm sure that many of you in the group tonight already know quite a bit about Burns, but just in case if there's anyone out there who doesn't, I want to provide some basic information to serve as a foundation for everyone participating in the program tonight. Robert Burns lived from 1759 to 1796. He had a short life, but a very productive one. He is hailed today, and has been for years, as the Bard of Ayrshire and the ploughman poet. Burns was born into rural poverty in Scotland and worked as a farmer for much of his short life, during which time he also wrote poetry. He wrote in the Scots dialect as well as in Standard English. He is probably best remembered and was most celebrated during his day for his Scots dialect poetry. That also poses, in terms of interpretation and readability, today sometimes a bit of a challenge. It's both sides of that coin. He's really one of the key figures in the literary movement known as Romanticism, because of his interest in folk culture as well as the content of his verses. It's important to know that Robert Burns composed original verse and collected traditional songs, often in the process modifying their lyrics or sort of expanding on the traditional verse that he would find, collecting the tunes, publishing those in various compendia. This was an extremely important enterprise that many Scots were engaged in the 1800s, gathering up, collecting, studying these traditional songs from various regions of Scotland. Some people did it in a very scientific, so to speak, way, in that they wanted to preserve the original lyrics, the original tunes. Burns, like others of sort of who had a different perspective, would modify them, expand them, refine them, so to speak. Burns portrayed and dignified Scottish folk culture, and that's a sort of rural culture, and that's a very important part of his reputation as well. His poems and songs depict life in the idyllic Scottish countryside. He did not become rich because of his writings. He farmed. He took a job in the sort of tax collecting sphere. He was also something of a notorious womanizer, who in recent years has received more scrutiny for his sexual behavior. And that certainly puts some of his work in a different light. We're going to talk about that in a deeper way later in the program. Similarly, his complex political opinions, which were very much the product of his time, have made Burns an important, though ambiguous, figure in Scottish nationalism and various social movements. He's certainly one of the most globally significant of the Romantic poets, but his rootedness in the Scots dialect and Scottish sense of place often have kind of obscured this point, even though Burns is celebrated all around the world, like we're doing right now. His significance sometimes has gone uncommented upon as compared to other poets. So one question that I want to pose, especially given the title of my presentation tonight, was Robert Burns a Highland heart? Now, those of you who know Burns and sort of were paying attention to the comments that I made when I was sharing his biography, Burns was not from the Highlands. He was a lowland Scot. He did visit the Highlands twice on tours, including a 1787 visit when he talked about how wild and savage the landscape and even the inhabitants of the Highlands were. So you might be wondering, why am I calling Robert Burns a Highland heart? Well, the reason is because in his poetry, the Highlands, the Scottish Highlands, come to serve as essentially a political and cultural symbol in Burns's works, a symbol for Scottish tradition, for Scottish heritage, and for Scottish resistance to, sort of political oversight or political control by others, and especially the importance of clan culture to Scottish heritage, which was sort of in a period of decline or had declined by this time. In the words of distinguished scholar Carol McGurk, Scotland, as Burns imagines it, is an intricate lacework of contraries and possibilities. Images drawn from the Highland landscape and culture serve in his writings as an idealized counterpart to the more down-to-earth imagery of the lowlands. And so that's why I call Robert Burns, for our purposes tonight, a Highland heart. And, of course, because one of his songs that I'm going to be playing a little bit later is My Heart's in the Highlands, which is a great example of how, in his work, the Highlands come to symbolize something broader than just a particular landscape. So Burns's work has been well known, over the last few centuries. He has remained famous during this time, but what's so interesting about Burns, and I'm a social historian by training, so I tend to take particular interest in these issues about sort of collective memory, how historical figures are remembered, how they're used in a culture. Burns has been very slippery in terms of how people have used him as a political figure. There's no question that he was deeply political in his life, but it was his politics, his cultural beliefs were very much a product of the late 1700s, and the world changed really dramatically from the 1700s into the early years of the 1800s, the Victorian era, all the way up through our own time. And the fascinating thing about Burns is that he has been employed to serve both conservative political ideologies and very radical political ideologies. And we're going to talk more tonight about both of those extremes in a way that I think is important, to think about when we're considering a figure like Robert Burns. As I mentioned earlier, the Rosenbach has truly one of the world's great Robert Burns collections. That is no exaggeration. We own approximately 117 Burns manuscripts, or handwritten documents, including 50 manuscript poems for some of Burns's most famous works, that which you see mentioned there on the screen. Works like For A' That and A' That, Bannockburn, Tam O'Shanter, The Rights of Woman, and more. Many of the documents that form the core of the Rosenbach's Burns collection had been assembled by another collector and then purchased by Dr. Rosenbach, one of our founders, in 1924, and the collection has expanded since that time, including works, pieces that had been owned by numerous other very prominent rare book collectors whose names you see on the screen in front of you. Those of you who have visited the Rosenbach, this bookcase probably looks pretty familiar to you. This is in our historic East Library at the Rosenbach, and you can see circled where many of our great printed Burns books are located. The Rosenbach doesn't just have manuscripts, we also have a lot of printed works, important books associated with Robert Burns. Many of the books that we own are association copies or volumes that were owned by sort of important people in Burns's life, sort of people who are connected to him. And we also have presentation copies, volumes that Burns presented to others during his life and autographed and wrote in. So needless to say, these are two great kinds of books. These are the types of books that Dr. Rosenbach loved and that any rare book aficionado likes to have, because they really put you right up close and personal with history. I want to give you a little bit of a taste of the Rosenbach's holdings in this collecting area. I'm just going to show you a few objects, and of course there are many, many more to continue exploring at a later time. The first item I'd like to share with you is a copy of the Scots Musical Museum, edited by James Johnson. Burns was one of the key contributors to this sort of compendium of Scottish music that James Johnson edited and gathered. I think it appeared in, I forget if it's 6 or 7 different volumes. Robert Burns contributed to probably the most, and he was one of the most prolific contributors. He basically ended up almost as a de facto editor in this project, and many of the pieces in this museum, this musical museum, were gathered by Burns and sort of embellished by him. It's significant that the work is called a musical museum, because it gives you that sense of museums gather historic artifacts and preserve them and interpret them, and that was the idea of this series, to gather up the artifacts of Scottish music and make them available to people today. You can see that this work is a presentation copy. Robert Burns inscribed this copy of the musical museum to Jane Murray. I will also share with you now an association copy. This book is the famed Kilmarnock edition of Burns's poems. As an association copy, that means that it was associated with a very important person in Robert Burns's life, in this case a woman named Frances Dunlop, who was a Scottish heiress and landowner, who was a friend and correspondent of Burns, a patroness. In the 18th century, writers, artists, musicians had to sort of find people to support them and encourage their work. Aristocrats and other well-to-do people. Mrs. Dunlop was an important friend of Robert Burns. The copy, this object is just, sort of an amazing, an iconic rare book, in the sense that this actually is Mrs. Dunlop's personal copy of Burns's poems, and there's the printed material. It's a printed book, it's a published book, so it's filled with actual published material, but then we also have manuscript copies of Burns' poems in Mrs. Dunlop's handwriting in the book, and that's what you see pictured here on the screen. Now I'm going to share with you the first Philadelphia connection of the evening. The first American edition of Burns's poems was published here in Philadelphia, and the Rosenbach owns a copy of this. You see poems chiefly in the Scottish dialect published here in Philadelphia on your screen now. Likewise, we have another edition of the poems. This is another presentation copy you see here. Robert Burns wrote a very nice inscription to his friend and sort of patron, John McMurdo, Chamberlain to the Duke of Queensberry. These two met in 1788. They were good friends, and Robert Burns, inscribed the book to McMurdo from the author, as you see on the screen. So that gives you a sense of the richness of our holdings. We're going to see a lot more Rosenbach objects throughout the rest of the evening, and the library professional in me wants to emphasize that these holdings are, made available to anyone who wants to come to our reading room and look at them. So you are encouraged to make good use of our Burns holdings. With that, I want to turn now to our first musical interlude, and I'm going to play two songs for you as sort of one set, so to speak. These I maybe shouldn't confess, but I will. These are sort of my two favorite pieces, my two favorite Burns songs, My Heart's in the Highlands and My Love is Like a Red, Red Rose. And I want you to think back to that chart that we looked at earlier that talked about what sort of different, what sort of factors came into Burns's work that makes him special and significant. Well, we see two different aspects in these verses, the lyrics that accompany these songs, or these tunes. With My Heart's in the Highlands, you get a strong sense of place about how Burns was framing the Highlands as the birthplace of valor and the country of worth. This is really significant. The Highlands were a wild place, were a sort of rustic place in the 18th century. Burns and others were transforming them into the birthplace of everything that was great about being Scottish. And you see that in Burns's verse here. The first verse of My Heart's in the Highlands is, Burns tells us, is traditional, and then he wrote more verses to the song. And so it's sort of that classic Burns combo, so to speak. Then the other song I'm going to play for you is My Love is Like a Red, Red Rose, which is often called the greatest love song ever written, both, I think, in terms of its melody as well as its lyrics. And so I'm going to play these two pieces for you now. So this brings me to the first discussion question that I want to pose this evening. We've now encountered Burns's poetry in the form of lyrics, and we have heard songs closely, or tunes closely associated with Burns' poems. And here's a question that I want you to consider. Can you think of a singer-songwriter working today whom you would describe, or maybe who describes him or herself as a poet? Who is this person, and what qualities make this individual, this artist, rise to the level of being both sort of a singer-songwriter and a poet? So please take a couple moments, enter some thoughts in the chat box if you can think of anyone who fits that category in the same way that Burns sort of does. And then Andrew, when you have some responses to share, please go ahead and read them out.
Well, it looks like Bob Dylan is sprinting into the lead. 2 have nominated him. And actually, Leonard Cohen also has 2 votes.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Well, as a native Minnesotan, I'm proud to say that Bob Dylan, I think, is maybe the best, or one of the best examples of this. It's partly also because he came out of the folk tradition, maybe in the same way that Burns did to a certain extent.
And Megan has nominated Lin-Manuel Miranda. And we've also had a nod to the Pogues. Patrick has highlighted Shane MacGowan. And Elizabeth says Stan Rogers for Canada.
Interesting. Yeah, those are all really great examples. Alicia Keys comes to my mind as well. I know that she's published, I think, at least 1 volume of poetry, maybe more. So this isn't such an unusual concept, right? But it is interesting to think about, what does it mean to be reading a poem, sitting in a chair reading a poem in silence, as compared to hearing it performed, maybe in the same way that these dancers on the screen, these revelers, are enjoying it.
We've had a few more quite wonderful ones come in. Nick Cave, a favorite of mine, Harry Chapin and Bruce Springsteen, John Prine, Janelle Monáe. So many wonderful examples of this.
Yeah, that's really cool. There are a lot of modern day resonances, I think, with this idea. So thank you all very much for sharing. I'm keeping my eye on the clock, and I need to start speeding through some of my commentary here a little bit more expeditiously. But let's dive in now to the next topic that I want to cover: Burns' politics, myth, and memory. So Robert Burns died in great poverty in 1796. He was rejected by many of the people who had supported him initially because of his radical politics, including support for the American Revolution and even the French Revolution in its earlier stages. And so his views sort of cost him some of his support. But over the next 60 years, British and global politics changed really dramatically. Specifically, I'm thinking of the Industrial Revolution. And so by the time of Burns's centenary in 1859, the Scottish upper class had sort of co-opted Burns's legacy, even though he had been very much the working man's poet, that sort of thing. The upper class in Scotland started using Burns as an example of exactly what a good peasant should be. Someone who lived in the countryside, wasn't one of these urban dwellers, because of course, by the middle of the 1800s, the economy of the United Kingdom had started to change in dramatic ways. So they framed Burns as sort of this rural figure and tried to use him as an example of Scottish patriotism, Scottish nationalism. And it was never a 100% comfortable fit because, well, Burns also was a noted egalitarian. And we see that come across, I think, very strongly in this quote from the scholar Christopher Whatley. Burns, as a poet and adapter of traditional songs, had multiple voices. He could be called the Protean Scot. It's difficult to claim him unambiguously for any particular set of values or a single political ideology. The Tories, or the Conservative Party in Scotland, looked backward and saw him as a model, whereas other, radicals and more progressive folks saw his egalitarian leanings as something to celebrate. It's important to remember, again, we think about Burns in the Scottish context, and that's really important, but Burns was functioning in a vast imperial world. He himself had connections, some positive, some not so great, to a broader imperial context. He lived within the imperial context, and his poetry ended up being transmitted through imperial channels, such that it ended up being published in the reform-minded Calcutta Journal in India, and as our own, Temple University's own Professor Steve Newman has written in this journal, Burns's work, Burns becomes the prophet of worldwide reform, perhaps even revolution, and sometimes as a conservative figure of Scottish solidarity, sometimes sort of in the superiority of the British, but also possibly having revolutionary tendencies. And so it's really hard to reduce Burns to any particular political leaning, especially after his own time had ended. A great example of his egalitarian work is this poem, For All That and All That. The Rosenbach holds it in manuscript. You see it on your screen now. The title of the piece is taken from an old Jacobite song, by which I mean a sort of old subversive song connected to another dynasty, not the one in power in Great Britain. And the main message of the lyrics of the verse is that a man's worth should be derived from his wealth or position, not from his wealth or position, but rather from his values. So this is probably his most politically inclined poem, and we happen to have it in manuscript at the Rosenbach. It's important to note, and maybe you see in that little clip that I have now on the bottom of my screen from the manuscript, he does make reference to slavery in his poem, not in the sense of human enslavement, but rather in a political sense. In the 18th century, especially around the time Burns was writing, the term slavery was often invoked as a political term for any group or state that was sort of dependent or forced into dependency by another political or cultural force. Interestingly enough, the term was often very much used in Europe around this time for its association with Roman Catholicism. It had a religious overtone. And so Burns, in many of his works, makes sort of use of the term slavery in a political context. It was really one of the important political vocabulary words, quite aside from the trade in sort of human trafficking that was shaping the Atlantic world economy of this time. But what happened was, around the time that Burns was writing, the anti-slavery movement aimed at ending human trafficking and forced labor was taking hold. And so Burns advocated for equality and at times expressed sympathy with the enslaved peoples, and seemed at times insensitive to the realities of African enslavement in particular in his writings. And this has become a key area of dialogue in Burns' studies, placing him within this broader world of the Age of Revolution and how Burns fit into this world of social movements that were shaping his world and the British Empire around the world at this time. I want to share with you a story that I encountered when I was doing research for this project that really touched my heart in some powerful ways. both because of this question of political resonance, but also because it makes a key point that I want to emphasize to you tonight as we talk about Robert Burns as a cultural figure. Very often when we talk about writers, we think about the writers themselves, their cult of personality, the work that they produced. But of course, writers can only be writers assuming that they have readers, people who are engaging with their texts. So we need to think about who's reading these works. Also, this story that I'm going to tell you connects in a powerful way to this idea of the radicalism inherent in Burns's works. The story is about a man named William Davidson, whom you see pictured on your screen. This portrait comes to us from the National Portrait Gallery in London, and you can find it on their website. William Davidson was born in Jamaica in the 1780s, probably the child or possibly the child of Jamaica's British Attorney General and a Jamaican woman. He was sent to Scotland at age 14 to study law. He was apprenticed to a lawyer in Liverpool. However, he ended up fleeing to sea, and like so many young men, especially, or so many young men in this time, ended up being press-ganged into the Royal Navy, by which I mean he was forced to join the Royal Navy. This, as it were, interestingly enough, this issue was one of the reasons why the United States went to war with Great Britain during the War of 1812. But anyways, he was press-ganged into the Royal Navy. After his time in the Navy, ended up studying mathematics, became a Methodist, taught for a short time, became a cabinet maker. He ended up, while back in England, I believe in London, joining a radical reading society, and essentially became exposed to the radical press and to radical ideas. He became involved in a conspiracy to assassinate cabinet members, but this was sort of a government trap. Davidson was arrested, convicted of treason, and was sentenced to death, and was indeed put to death in 1820. Now you may wonder, what's the connection to Robert Burns? Well, there's a very important connection to Robert Burns, which is, it is well known and was publicized sort of after the fact, that as he was being led to the gallows, William Davidson, sang the famous song, Scots Wha, also known as Bannockburn, and you see the Rosenbach owns the manuscript of that very song, and we have it, of course, in our various printed Robert Burns works as well. Now, this is such a key point, about how works of literature can find different interpretations. So on the one hand, we have, Scottish Tories embracing Burns as this cultural figure. On the other hand, we have a man who was himself, victimized by the imperial system of the British imperial system in the Atlantic world, embracing the lyrics of this verse, which, as you can maybe read on the screen, the essential message of this particular song drawing from Scottish history, the idea of rising up, so to speak. And so I wanted to share the story of William Davidson with you, again, to emphasize the importance of thinking about how our works like Burns's poems and songs read and experienced and heard in the world in which they were created and the time period that we're studying. So it's pretty incredible that we have this iconic manuscript in our collection. Another really important way to think about Robert Burns is in the realm of gender relations. In the age of revolutions, women were starting to claim greater civic rights, civil rights and political rights. Burns's famed romantic mindset had a dark side. He was somewhat reckless in his sexual encounters and took advantage of less privileged women during his lifetime. His first child he had his first child with his mother's housemaid, and composed the following verse about that birth. Welcome, lily bonny sweet wee daughter, though ye came here a wee unsought for. And Burns had many romantic relationships throughout his life, and this part of his history certainly puts in perspective his beautiful romantic lyrics that we encounter in his songs and in his poetry. I want to share with you another really key Rosenbach object, a key Rosenbach manuscript. First, I'll share with you these two other books that were published in 1792, Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man, Part the Second, Mary Wollstonecraft's famous work of philosophy of vindication of the rights of woman, which you see on the screen as well in its Philadelphia edition, 1792. Well, in 1792, Robert Burns wrote a satirical poem titled The Rights of Woman, which was written for and read by a famous actress, Louisa Fontanelle, in London in 1792. And it's a satirical poem in which Burns claims that women have access, or should have access, to three rights, those rights being protection, decorum, and admiration, i.e., they should be protected, admired, and treated politely by men, but essentially not offering them the same level of access to the political sphere and the intellectual sphere that others, like Mary Wollstonecraft, were arguing that women did deserve as sort of Enlightenment philosophy spread. Now, the funny thing is, by the time Burns wrote this, the cat was sort of already out of the bag, in the sense that women had started claiming in really powerful ways rights in the civic sphere, perhaps most famously in the march of working-class Parisian women to the Palace of Versailles in 1789. It's really interesting to note that Burns was familiar with Mary Wollstonecraft's work and vice versa, so he was engaging with people like Wollstonecraft and Thomas Paine in his writing, which is an important way to contextualize Burns's work. The Rosenbach's manuscript of The Rights of Woman also includes this letter that Burns wrote to Louisa Fontanelle, the actress who read this verse in 1792. In it, he compliments her great beauty, saying that your charms as a woman would ensure applause to the most indifferent actress, and your theatrical talents would secure admiration for the plainest figure. That said, Burns did engage very deeply with other women authors and advocates, including Helen Maria Williams, who was a key anti-slavery activist and revolutionary salon host in Paris, as it were, and hosted Mary Wollstonecraft and Thomas Paine at her salons. It also should be noted that Burns absolutely carried on very respectfully with other women, including Mrs. Dunlop, whom we discussed earlier. You see a letter that Burns wrote to Mrs. Dunlop on your screen, and then just as a reminder of the important copy of the Kilmarnock edition that we have in our collection. So with that, I'm going to move on now to my second musical interlude. I see it's already 7, so I'm going to keep this one a bit speedy so that we can get to the concluding portions of this tour. So those two songs are likewise sort of romantic, and in the case of Ebanks and Brays, also very sentimental. The lyrics dealing with an individual who is not taking responsibility for his responsibilities in a romantic relationship. So again, placing these songs within a broader Burns perspective is useful and important in understanding the full depth of his lyrics and of the beauty of his music. So with that, now is the time in the program when I want you to make your voice heard. We at the Rosenbach, of course, care about our audiences and our visitors, and I would be particularly interested to know what your favorite song is that you have heard performed this evening. I've played 5 for you. I Walk and O, My Heart's in the Highlands, My Love is Like a Red, Red Rose, I Found Kiss, and Ebanks and Brays. And I would like to ask you to vote, and, just for my own self-interest, I guess, I'm curious to know which piece you most enjoyed. So please take a moment, and then Andrew can report back what the results are.
We have a nice comment from Janet who says they were all wonderful, which I quite agree.
Thank you so much. Glad you enjoyed them.
And it looks as though we have our results. My Heart's in the Highland is just behind My Love is Like a Red, Red Rose, which I think at 30% with 10 votes is the winner. And I'll share the polling results so that everyone can see.
Great. Well, I will confess that piece is my favorite as well, so thank you all for participating in that. I do appreciate it. I'm gonna make an adjustment here so that I can advance my slides. Okay, so again, being mindful of the time of all of you in the audience, I am going to try to sort of progress quickly through the story that I want to share with you that has a really important Philadelphia connection related to the Riddle manuscripts, which are 2 volumes of poems and letters by Robert Burns. Considered a Scottish national treasure, they are housed today in Edinburgh largely because of the largesse of a Philadelphia businessman named John Gribble, whom you see on the screen. They're the largest single collection of Burns's manuscripts in existence, and were written around 1791 and sort of had a long history, as artifacts do, of transference between different people and organizations. They ended up at the Liverpool Athenaeum, which was a private library, and the Liverpool Athenaeum decided to sell them in 1913. Needless to say, this caused quite the uproar in Great Britain, and a bookseller, not Dr. Rosenbach, arranged for the sale of the volumes to an American client. Now it turned out that this American client was John Gribble, who was an industrialist and an energy magnate here in the region. He was a good customer of Dr. Rosenbach's, and his parents were Cornish, so he felt a connection to Celtic heritage. Gribble purchased the Riddle manuscripts in order to keep them in Scotland, so he bought them for the Scottish people, placed them under a deed of trust to assure that they would never again be sold, and the manuscripts to this day remain at the National Library of Scotland. So you can see here's the box that Gribble had made for the manuscripts. Philadelphia is immortalized on the box, on this case. And our colleagues at the National Library of Scotland kindly provided us with some photographs of the Riddle manuscripts for you to see. So thanks very much to everyone there for sharing this with us. This is a really important and fun local connection to Robert Burns's heritage. And here's the deed of trust that John Gribble created to protect the Riddle manuscripts. So this brings us now to the final discussion question I want to ask you as we start to wrap up the event tonight. Can you think of any other literary or artistic figure from a different culture than Burns who is as significant to his or her ethnic culture as Burns is to Scotland? And if you can think of a person with that same sort of cultural power, what makes him or her significant? So feel free to enter your thoughts in the chat box, and then Andrew, if we get any responses, please send them my way.
While we're waiting for responses, Alex, we had a few interesting questions. One was, did the Rosenbachs bid for the Glen Riddle manuscripts? Do we know?
I have no idea about that. If not to put Elizabeth Fuller, our librarian, on the spot, but if Elizabeth is in the audience, maybe she knows. I'm gonna say not, but that's just my guess based on a prior conversation with Elizabeth. But what do I know? I really can't tell you.
Another question Thomas had, what do the manuscripts reveal about, if anything, about Robert Burns's working process? Are they mostly presentation copies rewritten out as gifts, or are they his working manuscripts?
I will confess to you, I don't think I'm in a position really to answer that firmly, because most of my time in preparation for this program has been spent playing the harp. Andrew, you've worked with the manuscripts before. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
That's why I suggested that they were written out as presentation copies, because it's rare to see, and again, Elizabeth, our librarian, will have something to add here, but it's rare to see any corrections. They are sort of
Yeah.
perfect copies. So I wonder if they reveal anything at all about his working procedure.
Yeah, really interesting question, though.
We have some wonderful answers to your question. Goethe, a very deep part of Germany's culture, very true. Yeats has come up twice. Wagner, in perhaps to say the least ambivalent way, to Germany. Also Walt Whitman and Cervantes. So lots of fascinating people mentioned here.
Yeah, those are really good comparisons. Great. Feel free to continue if you have other thoughts on that question. Do feel free to continue entering them in the chat box. I want to move on now to start wrapping us up for the evening. So I'm going to return to this chart that I started our time together with. We've really seen how all of these different aspects of Robert Burns's work and life and cultural resonance come together to make him have the sort of legacy that he has today in the realm of literature, the realm of music, politics, collective memory, and sort of Scottish identity broadly conceived. The arts come together in Burns's work, sight and sound come together in song. He's really a distinctive cultural figure whose lasting legacy is so rooted in Scotland and yet so undeniably global, as evinced by the fact that Burns suppers, during non-pandemic years are celebrated all over the world. Burns's political legacy is an example of the difficulty of taking partisan views of one generation and sort of easily being able to translate them to another. And I will just again underscore that there are so many Philadelphia connections to Burns's legacy, and that's something that we can be really proud of. If you're interested in learning more about the Rosenbach's collection, which I hope you are, please do check out our new collections guide. My wonderful colleagues, our librarian Elizabeth Fuller and our registrar Joby Zink, have prepared a 37-page document that really outlines everything we have in our holdings connected to Robert Burns. And so that's a place for you to get started even from home, learning more about our holdings. Andrew will share the link to that in the chat box so that you can check it out. It's sort of hot off the press. It just was released today, so that's really exciting. If you're interested in learning more, please do make a collections inquiry with us at the Rosenbach. We love to answer your questions and help you connect with our collections and with other programs. I want to thank everyone who really played a role in making this program come together, our scholarly advisors, and all of my wonderful colleagues at the Rosenbach, without whom this truly couldn't have happened. It's sort of a complex program, and it's been fun to collaborate on pulling it off. If you enjoyed this program, I do want to invite you back to another little project that I have in the offing, which is another tour like this called Love's Old Sweet Song, the music of James Joyce, which is tentatively scheduled to premiere on June 24th. So watch your e-blasts for more information about that. Please do also participate in our upcoming Sundays with Frankenstein, hosted by my colleague Edward G. Pettit, starting this Sunday. So I hope that you can check our website for more information about this and participate in that really wonderful event as well. Our next Behind the Bookcase virtual tour is very much made for the season. Love Letters in the Archive, February 4th, 2021. Again, check the Rosenbach's events page to learn more about this event. And that brings me now to where I want to end our time together this evening. I read in the news yesterday that yesterday marked exactly 1 year since the first COVID-19 case was reported here in the United States. And I have been thinking very much over the last several days, several weeks, about how incredibly much all of our lives have changed, so dramatically, so profoundly in the past year. For some, it has been, terrible changes, terrible personal loss because of the coronavirus pandemic. For everyone, even those who have been spared personal terrible loss, the world is hardly recognizable. And one of the things that I so value about studying history and culture and literature and art is that study allows us to place our human experiences, the experiences that we have every day, in the much bigger, broader, longer story of our civilization, of our culture, and of humanity. And a key feature of being able to do that is to reflect on times long past, which is the rough translation of the title of one of Burns's most beloved songs, Auld Lang Syne. And so I would like us to close our time together this evening with an Auld Lang Syne sing-along with the verses that you see on the screen. I'll pull them back up for you in a moment. I'm going to play Auld Lang Syne twice, and we'll do these lyrics that you see here. For your sake as well as for mine, I am not going to sing for you. That is not my thing. But I will play for you, and you at home, rest assured, this is a webinar, so no one else can hear you on the Zoom call. And so you can just belt it out as loud as you want, or as quietly and sort of softly as you want. But I thought that this would be a really nice way for us to end and reflect on times long past and the year that was, and the hopeful times that lie ahead. So with that, I will return to my harp for our last song of the evening. So with that, I want to thank you all very, very much for participating in this program and spending part of your evening with me. I've had a lot of fun. I hope you have as well. Rest assured that I'm going to be emailing everyone who registered for this program with more information. So if you do have any other questions that you would like to talk about with me on any topic, harp, Burns, or the Rosenbach, we can be in touch that way. So again, thank you all so very much, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Have a nice night.